The dust hung in the late August air, a golden haze that smelled of dry corn husks and baked earth. It was the kind of stillness that precedes a storm, but the only thunder rumbling across Jedediah Stone's farm that afternoon was the low, gut-deep idle of the big bud. The tractor was a monster, a pale green behemoth from a bygone era of brute force. Its 8 tires, each taller than a man, sat on the hard-packed dirt of the farmyard like the feet of some prehistoric beast. Jed, perched on the massive front axle with a grease gun in his hand, worked a thick bead of molly grease into the articulation joint, the colossal pivot that allowed the tractor to bend in the middle. The Zerk fitting took the grease with a satisfying sigh, the joint flexing a fraction of an inch as the pressure built. He heard the other engine before he saw the truck, a high-strung whine that was all wrong for the countryside. A cloud of dust, far too aggressive for a neighborly visit, billowed up his half-mile lane. A brand-new, fire-engine red Ford F-250 slid to a stop, its chrome grille flashing in the sun. The driver's door swung open and out stepped Marvin Thorne, the owner of Thorne Modern Ag, the John Deere dealership in town. He wore a crisp green polo shirt, creased khaki pants, and boots that hadn't seen a speck of mud. He left his truck running, its V8 engine a nervous, impatient counterpoint to the big bud's steady thrum. "Jedediah," Marv called out, his voice smooth and practiced, like a radio announcer's. "Still wrestling with that old dinosaur. I'm surprised the Smithsonian hasn't called to claim it." Jed finished with the Zerk fitting, wiped the excess grease off with a red rag he pulled from his back pocket, and methodically screwed the cap back on his grease gun. He didn't look at Marv directly, instead sighting along the massive frame of his tractor. "She ain't wrestling, Marv. She's waiting. It's planting season soon." Marv chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. He walked a slow circle around the big bud, running a hand over one of the tires, then wiping it on his pants as if he'd touched something unclean. "Waiting for what, Jed? A complete structural failure. Look at this thing. It's all brute force and ignorance. No finesse, no technology. The cab probably sounds like you're inside a tin drum during a hailstorm." "I can hear the engine," Jed said, finally turning to face him. His voice was quiet, raspy from years of dust and diesel fumes. "I can feel what the plow is doing. That's all the technology I need." "That's old-timer talk, Jed. Your dad thought that way, and he worked himself into an early grave behind a Farmel M. This is 1978. The game has changed. It's about efficiency, comfort, precision. It's about leverage." Marv leaned against the front tire, a predator sizing up its prey. "I came out here to do you a favor. I've got a brand new John Deere 8640 on the lot. 4-wheel drive, 275 horsepower at the PTO, sound guard cab so quiet you can hear the radio, air conditioning, quad-range transmission. It'll do everything this relic can, but twice as fast, and you won't need a kidney belt to run it." Jed slid off the axle, his worn work boots landing softly in the dust. He was a tall man, lean and weathered like an old fence post, with hands that were permanently stained with grease and soil. "And what's a machine like that cost?" Marv's smile widened. "That's the beauty of it. We're not talking about cost, we're talking about investment. With corn prices where they are, it pays for itself. I'll give you a generous trade-in on this thing." He gestured dismissively at the big bud. "And we can finance the rest. The bank is friendly right now, real friendly. You could probably even pull some equity out of this land to cover the down payment. Get big or get out, Jed. That's what the Secretary of Agriculture says." Jed picked up his grease gun and his rag, his movements deliberate. "She's paid for, Marv." He looked from his tractor to Marv's gleaming truck. "This big bud, the combine in the shed, the land under our feet, it's all mine. Not mine and the bank's, just mine. Your 8640, who owns that? You? The bank? John Deere Credit?" The smile vanished from Marv's face. His eyes hardened. "That's a poor man's mentality, Jed. You're sitting on a gold mine and you're still trying to pan for nuggets with a tin plate. Your neighbors are buying the sections next to them. They're upgrading. They're building wealth. You're greasing a museum piece." "My father taught me something," Jed said, his voice dropping even lower. "He said the land remembers, Marv. It remembers who owns and who owes. It's patient. It'll wait for a man to make a mistake, to overreach, and when he does, the land is still here. The debt is still here. But the man is gone. Marv's face flushed red. Your father. He was a stubborn fool, and you're his spitting image. He could have been one of the biggest operators in this county, but he was too scared of the bank. And what did it get him? A small farm and a bad heart. You're on the same path, Jed. You'll be a footnote in the county plat book, while other men, smarter men, build empires. He turned on his heel, strode back to his truck, and slammed the door. The Ford's engine roared as he spun the tires in Jed's driveway, kicking up a rooster tail of gravel and dust that pelted the side of the machine shed. Jed stood perfectly still, watching until the red truck disappeared down the lane. He looked at the big bud, its simple, honest lines a comfort against the slickness of Marv's sales pitch. The big Cummins diesel rumbled on, a faithful, steady heartbeat. Paid for. The words echoed in the sudden quiet. It was more than a financial status. It was a creed. Before we get into the thick of it, I have to ask you folks listening to this. Have you ever faced a choice like that? The world screaming at you to borrow, to upgrade, to get the new and shiny thing that promises to make your life easier, while your gut tells you to stick with the old and reliable, the thing you own free and clear. It's a choice that defined a generation of farmers, and I'd be interested to hear your story. Let me know in the comments below, what did you choose? A few weeks later, the choice seemed to mock him. Jed was making his last pass with the big 24-foot chisel plow, turning over the corn stubble before winter set in. The big bud pulled the heavy implement like it was a garden rake, the Cummins engine singing its deep baritone song under the strain. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in strokes of orange and purple. He was on the last 10 acres when he felt it. A slight hesitation in the hydraulics when he lifted the plow at the headland. He dismissed it as a fluke, but on the next turn, the hesitation was worse. The big hydraulic cylinders that lifted the heavy plow shuddered, and the plow itself only came up halfway. He pulled the tractor to a stop and climbed down, his boots sinking into the soft, tilled earth. A dark, oily sheen coated the massive main lift cylinder on the right side. He ran a gloved hand over it, and it came away slick with hydraulic fluid. He followed the drip up to the gland nut, the big retaining nut at the end of the cylinder barrel. It was weeping. Not just a drop, but a steady, rhythmic pulse of hot, thin oil that matched the thrum of the engine. The main seal was gone. A curse escaped his lips, low and bitter. This wasn't a simple fix. That cylinder was nearly 6 inches in diameter and 5 feet long. It weighed hundreds of pounds. Marv's words echoed in his head. Complete structural failure. It wasn't that, not yet, but it was a job that would put him down for days, maybe a week. He limped the tractor back to the farmyard, the chisel plow dragging and gouging the lane. The smell of hot hydraulic oil filled the cab, a sickeningly sweet odor of failure. He parked it in front of the machine shed, the big building his grandfather had raised, and shut down the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the tick-tick-tick of the cooling manifold and the steady drip of oil onto the dirt. The next morning, the real work began. There was no calling a service truck. That was Marv's world. In Jed's world, you fixed what was yours. He chained the chisel plow's frame to the back of his old International grain truck to keep it from falling, then started the painstaking process of disconnecting the hydraulic lines. The big 3/4-inch lines were stiff and stubborn. He put a 24-inch pipe wrench on one fitting and a backup wrench on the other, leaning his whole body into it. The fitting broke loose with a groan of protesting steel. Cold, thick hydraulic fluid oozed out, running down his arm. Getting the cylinder itself off was a feat of engineering. The retaining pins were 4 inches in diameter, solid steel. He drove them out with a sledgehammer and a brass drift, each ringing blow a testament to his frustration. The cylinder was now free, but it was still a 1/4 ton of dead weight. He backed his old Farmall M, the tractor his father had indeed worked to death on, up to the big bud. He used its small front-end loader and a web of logging chains to carefully cradle the massive cylinder and lower it onto a pair of sawhorses. The machine shed became his operating room. The air grew thick with the smell of solvent and oil. He clamped the cylinder in a massive vise bolted to a workbench his father had built from railroad ties. The gland nut was the next obstacle. It had been tightened at the factory decades ago and hadn't moved since. He tried a 4-foot pipe wrench. It wouldn't budge. He heated the cylinder housing with a rosebud torch, trying to expand the metal just enough. He put the pipe wrench back on, slipped a 6-foot steel cheetah pipe over the handle, and threw his entire weight against it. The world was nothing but the strain in his back and the pressure in his arms. With a sound like a gunshot, the nut broke free. Inside, the problem was clear. The main U-cup seal was brittle and cracked, with a chunk missing. The piston wipers were worn to nothing. He spent the next day meticulously cleaning every component, polishing the cylinder rod with crocus cloth to remove any tiny burrs that might tear a new seal, flushing the barrel until it was spotlessly clean. He didn't go to Marv's for parts. He knew what would happen. Marv would look up the part number for a big bud, declare it obsolete, and then try to sell him a whole new tractor again. Instead, Jed drove the 50 miles to a dusty old-school hydraulic shop in a neighboring county. A place run by a man named Hank who had forgotten more about hydraulics than Marv Thorne would ever know. Hank took one look at the old seals, measured them with a pair of worn calipers, and disappeared into a back room filled with floor-to-ceiling bins of parts. He returned a few minutes later with a new set of seals. "Polyurethane," Hank grunted. "Better than the original rubber. This should outlast you, Jed." The cost was $87. A new cylinder from a dealer, if you could even get one, would have been thousands. Back at the farm, the reassembly was just as grueling as the teardown. A slow, careful process of lubricating the new seals and coaxing the massive piston back into the cylinder barrel without tearing anything. He used the farm awl and the chains again, hoisting the rebuilt cylinder back into place on the big bud. His knuckles were raw, his back ached with a deep, burning pain, and his coveralls were soaked through with a mixture of sweat and oil. He reconnected the lines, topped off the hydraulic reservoir with 5 gallons of new Hytran fluid, and climbed into the cab. He took a deep breath and turned the key. The big Cummins roared to life. He let it warm up for a minute, his heart pounding in his chest. He slowly pulled the hydraulic lever. The cylinder extended, smooth and silent. There were no hesitations, no shudders. He lowered it. Perfect. He cycled it a dozen more times. Not a single drop of oil leaked from the new seals. He climbed down and stood before the tractor, a wave of profound relief and satisfaction washing over him. It was more than just a repair. It was a victory. A small, private confirmation of his father's words. He had faced a problem, a serious one, and he had solved it with his own 2 hands, his own ingenuity, and without writing a check to a man like Marv Thorne. The gossip at the grain elevator would die down, the head shaking would stop. His big bud was ready for spring. The next few years were like a fever dream for the American farmer. In 1972, the Russians, facing a disastrous harvest, bought nearly a quarter of the U.S. wheat crop. The Great Grain Robbery, some called it. But for farmers in Iowa, it was the beginning of a gold rush. The price of corn, which had hovered around $1 a bushel for years, surged past $3. Soybeans went to the moon. Suddenly, farming wasn't just a way of life, it was a fast track to wealth. The mantra from the government, from the universities, from the banks, was Earl Butz's famous decree, "Get big or get out." And no one preached that gospel with more fervor than Marv Thorne. His dealership transformed. The old, modest building was torn down and replaced with a sprawling steel structure with a glass-fronted showroom that looked more like a car dealership in the city. Inside, gleaming green machines sat under fluorescent lights. The new 50 Series John Deeres, with their advanced hydraulics and transmissions, and the massive articulated 8850, a 370 horsepower beast that made Jed's big bud look almost quaint. Marv himself became a local celebrity. He was president of the Chamber of Commerce. His picture was always in the paper, shaking hands with a politician or handing a giant check to a local charity. He traded his Ford pickup for a new Cadillac. He bought the old Miller farm on the edge of town and built a sprawling brick house with white columns, a place so grand the locals called it the plantation. He bought land. He bought it with a ravenous appetite, leveraging every acre he owned to buy 2 more. The bankers loved him. He was the face of the new, aggressive, modern farmer. Jed watched all of this from a distance. The boom years were good to him too. He sold his corn and beans for prices his father could only have dreamed of. But his reaction was different. He didn't see the high prices as a new reality. He saw them as a temporary gift, a windfall to be treated with caution. The first thing he did was pay off the last of his father's old operating notes at the bank. He walked into the farmer's trust and savings, found Mr. Abernathy, the aging bank president, and handed him a check that cleared the final slate. Abernathy, a man from his father's generation, shook his hand firmly. "Your father would be proud, Jedediah. There aren't many young men who value being debt-free anymore." "It helps me sleep at night, Mr. Abernathy," Jed replied. With the farm truly his, free and clear, he didn't look to expand. He looked to improve. He spent a summer tiling the 80 acres in the low-lying backwater, a job that cost a fortune but turned a perennially wet piece of ground into his most productive field. He tore down the old hog barns that were falling in and built a new state-of-the-art machine shed, a massive pole building where he could work on his equipment out of the winter wind and summer sun. He paid for it in cash. He pulled the engine on his old International 1460 combine and rebuilt it himself, top to bottom. The rest of the money, the vast majority of it, he put in the bank. Certificates of deposit, mostly. Safe, boring, and earning a modest 5% interest. His neighbors thought he was insane. Tom Haskins, who farmed the section to his north, stopped by one afternoon. Tom had just bought a new John Deere 4840 and a 200-acre parcel that bordered Jed's land. He was beaming, full of the infectious optimism of the era. "Jed, you're sitting on a gold mine," Tom said, leaning against the fender of Jed's perfectly maintained farmall. "That 160 acres south of you is coming up for sale. Old man Hemlock is retiring. You could borrow against your place, buy that ground and pay it off in 5 years with these prices. You're missing the boat." Jed just shook his head. "The boat might sink, Tom. I like the shore just fine." Tom laughed. "You sound just like my grandpa. Jed, this is different. The whole world needs our grain now. The demand is endless. Land values are only going one way, up. You're being too cautious." It was a conversation he had a dozen times, at the co-op, at the diner, at church. He was seen as a relic, a man out of time, a failure in a strange way. In an era where debt was a tool and expansion was a sign of success, his fiscal prudence was viewed as a lack of ambition, a failure of imagination. He was the man who refused to play the game, who sat on the sidelines while everyone else was getting rich. One cold November evening, long after the harvest was done, Jed was in his new machine shed. The concrete floor was swept clean, his tools were hung neatly on the walls, and the big Bud sat in the center, its engine block warm from a new oil change. He had the radio on, a local station playing old country music. The song faded out and the news came on. The announcer's voice was grim, a stark contrast to the usual farm report optimism. And in Washington, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker today reiterated his commitment to breaking the back of inflation, which is now running at over 13%. Financial markets are reacting to the Fed's aggressive strategy of raising the federal funds rate. The prime lending rate, the rate banks charge their best customers, hit an unprecedented 15% this morning, and analysts predict it could climb even higher in the coming months as the Fed continues to tighten the money supply. Jed reached over and turned the radio off. The silence that filled the massive steel building was heavy, profound. He could hear the wind whistling around the eaves. 15%. He did the math in his head. The operating loans that men like Tom Haskins and Marv Thorne took out every spring to buy seed and fertilizer were variable rate loans tied to the prime. The land loans they took out were the same. He walked to the big sliding door and pushed it open a few feet, letting in a blast of cold, damp air. He looked out across his fields, dark and resting under a sliver of a moon. They were his. They asked for nothing but his sweat and his care. They carried no interest, no liens, no notes due. Out there, in the darkness, all across the heartland, the world was changing. The music had stopped. The party was over. A storm was coming, an economic hurricane of a magnitude no one had seen since the Great Depression. It was a storm that wouldn't be measured in inches of rain, but in percentage points. A storm that would wash away either the debt or the men who carried it. And Jedediah Stone, standing in the doorway of his paid-for machine shed, knew he was ready to ride it out. The summer of 1980 arrived not with gentle warmth, but with the searing breath of a blast furnace. The sky turned a pale, hazy blue, bleached of color and moisture. Day after day, the sun beat down on the cornfields of Iowa, curling the leaves into tight, desperate cylinders. The rain, which had been so reliable in the boom years, simply vanished. Ponds shrank, their edges cracking into intricate mosaics of dried mud. The deep, black soil of Jedediah Stone's farm turned to a fine grey powder that puffed up around his boots with every step. Jed watched his corn suffer. He had planted it into perfect moisture, and for a while it had thrived. Now the stalks were stunted, the ears small and poorly filled. There was nothing he could do but watch and wait, a helpless feeling he knew all too well. His only consolation was the silence from his bank. There were no loan payments breathing down his neck, no interest clock ticking away his equity. The drought was a blow, but it wouldn't be a fatal one. For his neighbors, it was a different story. The drought was the first gust of a hurricane that had been building on the horizon. Tom Haskins, who had so confidently advised Jed to borrow and expand, was one of the first to feel its force. One blistering afternoon in July, Jed saw Tom's gleaming John Deere 4840 sitting motionless in the middle of his field, the big round baler behind it silent. Jed drove his old pickup down the lane and found Tom sitting on the ground in the tractor's meager shade, his head in his hands. "She just quit, Jed," Tom said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Was running fine, then a light comes on in the dash, a little picture of a gear, and she just locked up. Won't move forward. Won't move back. Transmission's gone." Jed looked at the tractor. It was a marvel of modern engineering, its sound guard cab a sealed capsule of cool air and quiet. But under the sleek green skin was a labyrinth of wires, solenoids, and hydraulic lines he couldn't begin to decipher. "Did you check the fluid? The filters?" "First thing I did. It's something electronic, Jed. Something deep inside that quad-range transmission. I called Marv Thorne's shop. They said they'll send a service truck out, but it won't be till tomorrow morning. $150 just for the call, plus $60 an hour for the mechanic, and that's before they even find the part." The next day, Jed saw the Thorne Modern Ag service truck, a rolling workshop in itself, parked next to the crippled tractor. A young mechanic in a clean green uniform spent most of the day with a diagnostic computer plugged into a port under the dash. Late in the afternoon, the truck finally left. The tractor hadn't moved. That evening, Tom came over, his face ashen. "It's a solenoid pack in the transmission control valve," he said, slumping into a chair at Jed's kitchen table. "The part is $400. Labor to get to it is another $1,000. And they have to order it from the regional depot in Moline. It'll be a week, maybe 2. My hay is rotting in the field, Jed. A week." He shook his head slowly. "And the bill? I have to put it on my operating note at the bank. At 18% interest." The cracks were appearing everywhere. Driving into town for supplies, Jed saw the signs. Marv Thorne's dealership lot, once a showcase of new iron, was now crowded with used equipment. Not just trade-ins, but late-model machines that looked suspiciously new. Repossessions. A massive 8850, the king of the John Deere line, sat near the road, a paper sign taped to its window. It had been sold less than a year ago to a young farmer who had bought up 3 sections south of the river. Now it was back. Marv himself looked different. The easy smile was gone, replaced by a tight, forced grin. The confident swagger had become a hurried, nervous stride. Jed saw him one day at the co-op, arguing with the manager over the terms of his bulk fuel contract. Marv's voice was sharp, edgy. He looked thinner, his crisp polo shirt hanging a little loose on his frame. The empire of leverage was beginning to groan under its own weight. The endless upward spiral of land values and crop prices had stopped, and now gravity was taking over. One evening, Jed was in his shed, methodically disassembling the carburetor from his old grain truck. The big Cummins in the Big Bud was a simple beast, but this little gasoline engine required a more delicate touch. He had the tiny jets and springs laid out on a clean red rag when he heard a vehicle pull into the yard. It wasn't the aggressive roar of Marv's old Ford, but the tired rattle of a worn-out pickup. It was Tom Haskins. He didn't get out right away. He just sat in his truck, the engine idling roughly, staring at the big bud through his dusty windshield. Finally, he killed the engine and walked over, his boots scuffing in the gravel. "Jed," he started, his voice quiet. I came to ask a favor." "What do you need, Tom?" Tom gestured vaguely toward his own farm. "The bank, they called my note. With the bad crop and the interest rates, I can't make the payment on that new ground I bought, or the tractor. They're foreclosing." He swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the ground. "They're having the auction in 2 weeks, selling everything. The land, the equipment, the house, everything." Jed felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had known it was bad, but this was the reality. "I'm sorry, Tom, truly sorry. It's not your fault. It's mine. I listened to the wrong people. I thought the good times would never end." He finally looked up, his eyes pleading. "My dad's old tractor. It's an International 806. It's not worth much, but it was his. It's the one thing I want to keep for my boy. The bank won't let me take it. It's part of the asset list. I was wondering, at the auction, if you could bid on it for me. I've scraped together a little cash, maybe $1,500. If you could buy it, I'll pay you back. I swear I will." Jed looked at the man, his neighbor, broken by the same system that had promised him the world. "You don't have to pay me back, Tom," Jed said softly. "I'll buy the tractor. It'll be here in my shed when you need it." The day of the Haskins auction was cold and grey, a November sky threatening a winter that everyone knew would be long and hard. The yard was filled with farmers, but they weren't there with the cheerful chatter of a community gathering. They were silent, their faces grim, their hands shoved deep in their pockets. They were vultures and victims at the same time, picking over the bones of a fallen neighbor, all of them knowing they could be next. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant, usually a sound of commerce and opportunity, felt like a funeral dirge. Jed watched as Tom's life was sold off in lots. The new 4840, with less than 500 hours on it, sold for 60 cents on the dollar to a syndicate of investors from Des Moines. The new land, the parcel Tom had been so proud of, went for half of what he'd paid for it. Marv Thorne was there, standing near the back of the crowd. He wasn't bidding. He was just watching, his face a mask of stone. He looked like a general watching his own army get slaughtered. Every piece of shiny green equipment that sold for a loss was another cut, another drain on his own precarious finances. The bank would come to him, the dealer, to cover the difference on the loans he had co-signed. When the old International 806 came up, Jed raised his hand. He bought it for $1,200, the bidding uncontested. After the auction, he found Tom and his family loading a few personal boxes into a U-Haul trailer. Jed didn't say a word, he just handed Tom the keys to the old tractor. Tom's wife was crying silently. Tom just nodded, his throat too tight for words, and shook Jed's hand. It was the last time Jed saw them. They moved out of state, another family erased from the county plat book. The winter that followed was the cruelest in memory. It wasn't the snow or the cold, but the silence. The phone calls stopped. The friendly visits ceased. Debt and fear had isolated everyone. The only news came in the form of more auction notices tacked to the bulletin board at the post office. Smith, Jensen, Peterson. The names were a litany of the fallen. The final collapse came in the spring of 1982. The prime rate had peaked, but land values had cratered, wiping out the equity that had held the whole fragile system together. The farmers' trust and savings, the bank that had so eagerly handed out money for a decade, was itself on the verge of collapse, crushed by a portfolio of bad agricultural loans. Federal examiners came in from Omaha, and the friendly handshakes were replaced by cold, hard demands for payment in full. The biggest domino to fall was Marv Thorne. His personal debt, tied to the thousands of acres he had bought at inflated prices, was astronomical. His dealership, Thorne Modern Ag, was a ghost town. The bank that held the note on his massive inventory called it in. One morning, the town woke up to find chains on the doors of the glass-fronted showroom. A sign, printed in stark black letters, was taped to the door. Closed. Bankrupt. The auction for Thorne's assets was the biggest the county had ever seen. It wasn't just a farm auction, it was the death of an era. They held it at the dealership. The gleaming showroom floor was scuffed and dirty, the empty offices echoing with the auctioneer's call. They sold everything: the parts bins, the hydraulic press, the special diagnostic tools, the very sign that bore his name. Jed was there. He bought a few things: a heavy-duty floor jack, a set of industrial sockets. Things he needed, things he could pay for with cash from his pocket. He watched as they auctioned off Marv's personal truck, the fire-engine red Ford F-250. It was dusty and had a dent in the fender now. It sold for a pittance. The final sale of the day was for Marv's personal farm, the original Thorne homestead that had been in his family for 100 years. It included the grand house he had built, the plantation, a monument to an ambition that had turned to ash. The crowd was thick. Investors from the city, insurance companies, the new breed of corporate farm managers were all there, smelling blood in the water. The bidding was fast and brutal. It quickly surpassed what any local farmer could afford. Jed stood at the back, just watching, a deep sadness settling over him. This wasn't a victory, it was a tragedy. He saw Marv standing alone by a fence post, far from the crowd. He wasn't the slick salesman anymore. He was just a man, stripped of everything. He wore a simple work shirt and faded jeans. He looked 10 years older. Jed walked over to him. Marv didn't look up. "Heard you're still running that old Big Bud," Marv said, his voice a rough whisper. "She's running fine," Jed replied. "My granddad bought this place with a team of mules," Marv said, staring at the old barn. "He never owed a man a dime. He warned my father about the banks. My father, he warned me." He finally looked at Jed, his eyes hollow. "You and your dad were right. All this time, you were right. I built an empire out of paper, Jed, and the first strong wind just blew it all away." Jed watched as the auctioneer's chant reached a crescendo. "Sold. To the Consolidated Agriculture Corporation of Chicago." A murmur went through the crowd. Another piece of the county sold to a faceless name on a piece of paper. Marv flinched as if he'd been struck. He turned and walked away, not toward a fancy truck, but toward a beat-up Chevy Nova parked down the road, and drove away without looking back. Jed watched him go, feeling not a shred of triumph, only a profound sense of loss for his community. He had survived, but he was lonelier for it. In the years that followed, the dust settled, both literally and figuratively. The rains returned. Crop prices stabilized at a new, more sober level. The heartland began to heal, but the scars remained. The landscape was changed. Fewer farmhouses dotted the countryside, their lights no longer twinkling in the dusk. The fields were bigger, straighter, farmed by men in massive air-conditioned machines who often lived 100 miles away. Jedediah Stone endured. He was no longer seen as the stubborn fool, but as the man who had seen the storm coming. He became an unlikely pillar of the community. When a neighbor's old tractor broke down, it was Jed they called, not a dealer. He'd drive over in his old pickup, his toolbox rattling in the back, and spend an afternoon helping them get it running again. He never charged for his time, only asking for a cup of coffee. His machine shed became a gathering place, a library of old iron and hard-won knowledge. He taught younger farmers how to weld, how to time a diesel engine, how to rebuild a hydraulic cylinder. He taught them the difference between cost and value. One day, a few years after the bust, a familiar beat-up Chevy Nova pulled into his lane. Marv Thorne got out. He was working as a hired hand for one of the big corporate farms, the very entities that had bought up his old land. The work was hard, the pay was low, and the pride was gone. "Jed," he said, twisting a worn cap in his hands, "I heard you bought the old Hemlock place, south of you, at the tax sale." Jed nodded. He had bought it for pennies on the dollar, the land nobody wanted, paying cash from his savings. "I was wondering," Marv said, his eyes on his boots, "if you need a hand. I know that ground. I know how it drains, where the clay spots are. I just need the work." Jed looked at the man who had once mocked him, who had called his father a fool. He saw no trace of the arrogant salesman, only a farmer who had lost his way and wanted to come home. "I could use a good man," Jed said. "Planting season starts next week. Be here at dawn." Marv worked for Jed for the next 10 years. There was a quiet understanding between them. They rarely spoke of the past, they just worked. They worked the land together, Jed in the seat of his old Big Bud, Marv in the cab of a well-maintained Farmall 1066 that Jed had bought at an auction and rebuilt. Marv learned to appreciate the simple reliability of the old machines, the satisfaction of fixing something with his own hands. In a way, Jed didn't just give him a job. He gave him back a piece of who he used to be before the fever of debt and expansion had taken hold. Jed never got big. His farm was modest by the new standards of the 1990s, but it was his. He had no debt, his equipment was immaculate, and his fields were among the most productive in the county. He had peace of mind, a treasure more valuable than any line of credit. One warm spring afternoon, years later, Jed was out in the machine shed. He was an old man now, his hair white, his movements slow but still deliberate. The Big Bud sat in its usual spot, looking as powerful and timeless as ever. His grandson, a boy of 10 named Samuel, stood beside him. "Grandpa," the boy asked, looking up at the giant green engine, "why do we still use this old tractor? Dad says all the other farmers have new ones with computers and GPS." Jed picked up a grease gun, the same one he had used decades ago. He handed it to the boy. "Feel that?" he said. "It's heavy, it's real, it's made of steel. You can understand it. You can fix it." He pointed to the big articulation joint. "Now you put the nozzle on that little fitting there, the zerk. Squeeze the handle until you see a little bit of new grease, push the old grease out. That's how she stays alive." Samuel put the grease gun to the fitting and squeezed with all his might. A neat collar of fresh black grease appeared. A look of pride spread across his face. Jed smiled, a deep, knowing smile that creased the corners of his eyes. "Your great-grandfather taught me something, Sam. He said the land remembers. It remembers who owns and who owes. The world will always try to sell you something new, something fast, something easy. It'll tell you to borrow, to bet on a future that isn't promised." He placed a heavy, calloused hand on the boy's shoulder and looked from the tractor to the field stretching out beyond the open shed door, green with the promise of a new crop. "But this," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble like the engine of the old tractor, "this land, this machine. As long as you own them and they don't own you, you'll always have a place to stand. You'll always be free." The boy looked at his grandfather, then at the massive tractor, and for the first time he began to understand. The low thrum of the big diesel wasn't just the sound of an engine. It was the steady, faithful heartbeat of a legacy.